As we continue our reading of Henry IV Part 2 into Acts 2 and 3, we see what basically amounts to a mirror scene of some of the incidents that we saw take place back in Henry IV Part 1. Hal and Poins are setting Falstaff up for humiliation in the form of a joke. He lies about it to save face, and all real-world problems, such as the urgency of war and rebellion, are being ignored. But we're starting to see fractures emerge that we didn't see before. Hal seems more fed up with his companions than he did in the past. Now he's insulting Poins to his face, and his attitude toward Falstaff is even more brusque and annoyed. His neglected duty is laying heavily on his conscience. He's meditating on the death of his father, which now, to him, seems imminent. And he feels like people are going to call him a hypocrite if he mourns for his father when he passes. And this is because, 1, people will assume that he's secretly happy to have gained the crown, and 2, because he's spent so much time with Falstaff that he's largely neglected his father all of his life. He's been a stranger to him and to the court. So these games that he plays with his friends are only going to keep his mind off of things for so long. Meanwhile, as I mentioned briefly in last week's lecture, we have a funny scene where Mistress Quickly is trying to have Falstaff taken into custody for the debt that he's refusing to pay her. A scuffle ensues, and the whole thing ends in a rather unexpected way, but also a comic way. Not only does Falstaff get Mistress Quickly to drop the lawsuit, he gets her to lend him 10 more pounds, and to arrange for him to meet up with a prostitute named Doll Tearsheet at her inn for dinner that evening. Mistress Quickly, we can tell, isn't that bright, and Falstaff is, as we know, sly. Whenever she wakes up to the fact that he's taking advantage of her, he can easily charm his way back into her good graces, and that's what he does here. And when we meet Doll Tearsheet, we can see that the same thing holds true for her as well. So this dinner with Doll is arranged. Hal and Poins are going to spy on the date by dressing up as drawers or waiters, and presumably they're going to ruin his romantic evening that he has planned. It's almost ruined by somebody else, however, before they even get the chance. We're introduced to a man named Ancient Pistol, and he's quite the character in and of himself. Now, an ancient, or an ensign, was someone who was a flag bearer in the army. It's a military title. So Pistol isn't really an old man. The fact that people call him Ancient Pistol, this just means that he's in the army. He would have been the standard bearer. So Pistol interrupts their evening, completely drunk, and he speaks almost entirely in snippets of dialogue from other plays that Shakespeare's audience would have been familiar with. So we get the impression of a man who spends all of his free time in a theater, and who tries to be literary and grand, but badly mangles all of the quotations. So if you were reading this and wondering why most of Pistol's lines don't make much sense, that would be why. They would have made sense to Shakespeare's original audience. They probably would have seen the plays that Pistol's quoting as well and laughed at the allusions. For instance, one of his lines where he talks about hollow-pampered jades of Asia is a quote from one of Shakespeare's contemporaries and one of his main competitors, Christopher Marlowe. And there's, not just in this play, but in other plays too, lots of indications that Shakespeare liked to have fun by taking solemn speeches from other writers' works and putting them into the mouths of his drunkards and his fools, like Pistol. And to say that he's drunk is an understatement. He's belligerent, and Doll makes matters worse by insulting him. So a fight actually ensues, and Falstaff has to drive him out of the room, which leads both Doll and Mistress Quickly to fawn over him, to start petting him like he's just performed some valorous feat, like he's just chased off an army. But then, in the midst of all this humor, an almost tender scene ensues. Falstaff, in a moment of what he believes to be privacy, confesses to Doll that he feels old and that he's tired. And while he's saying this, Doll tells him that she loves him better than all the rascally young men combined. But then Hal and Poins reveal themselves, because Falstaff has just talked trash about both of them to put himself in a better light, and the moment of intimacy is ruined. Falstaff immediately throws Doll under the bus. He says that the only reason that he spoke bad about Hal and Poins was because they were good men. They were honorable men, and he didn't want someone like wicked Doll to form an attachment to them. So he purposely spoke bad about them so she wouldn't like them. And this is a lie that's just about as believable as his fleeing from the two of them at the Gad's Hill robbery, because he knew it was them all along. So again, this scene is kind of mirroring the scenes that we saw back in the last play. But the fun is interrupted, just like in the last play, by news that the army is on the move. War is approaching. Falstaff has to be off, and Hal needs to get back to his father at Westminster. There's also a scene in Act 2 where we see Northumberland failing, once again, to live up to his word. He knows that his reputation is tarnished, and he's all set to go off to battle and to either die bravely and nobly or to perish in the attempt. But his wife and his daughter-in-law, who we met in the last play, this is Hotspur's widow, they talk him out of it. It's actually Kate Percy's speech that convinces him. She says, "Look, if you didn't go to battle when your own son was actually in danger, why would you go now? Or why would you hold your honor of more worth now when there's less risk in going?" So both she and Northumberland's wife do their best to talk him out of riding off to war, and they succeed. He decides that he's going to go with them and hide in Scotland until he can determine if the Archbishop and the rebels are coming out ahead or not. So the Archbishop, Mowbray, Bardolph, and the others were wise to lay out their plans without relying on Northumberland's help. At the beginning of Act 3, and keep in mind this is just about halfway through the play, we see that King Henry takes the stage for the first time in a play that bears his name. And he's not doing so well. He's suffering from insomnia, wandering the halls of the palace at night. And he gives a soliloquy, which is something like a prayer to sleep. He asks it why it pays visitation to soldiers and sailors in loud, harsh environments, but won't come visit him in his stately, quiet, perfumed chambers. And he ends this soliloquy by saying, "Then happy low, lie down. Uneasy lies the head that wears a crown." And those are really revealing lines because we see that he's come to realize the burden of ruling, that being king isn't all fun and games. It's destroyed his health, his peace of mind, and now it's even taken sleep away from him. He considers in this soliloquy that the most common of his subjects are better off than he is, because at least they have peace of mind and rest. Then some of his earls come to see him. If they're annoyed about being woken up in the middle of the night, they don't give any indications of it. But you're not really going to complain to the king about the late hour either. And they approach him and they discuss how the war is going on. And during this discussion, Henry reflects on fate and on free will. He muses that if a person could look into the future and see what was in store for them, they would probably just curl up and die right there, which is a grim thing to think, but that's what he says. He says, "O God, that one might read the book of fate and see the revolution of the times make mountains level, and the continent, weary of solid firmness, melt itself into the sea. And other times to see the beachy girdle of the ocean too wide for Neptune's hips. How chances, mocks, and changes fill the cup of alteration with diverse liquors. Oh, if this were seen, the happiest youth, viewing his progress through, what perils past, what crosses to ensue, would shut the book and sit him down and die." Then he thinks back to the prediction that Richard made about Northumberland, how he had proven false to one king and would then prove false to another. But one of his earls, Warwick, he kind of poo-poos the idea of prophecy, and he says that it was only logical for Richard to predict Northumberland's future actions based on his past actions. He says, "There is a history in all men's lives, figuring the nature of the times deceased, the which observed, a man may prophesy with a near aim of the main chance of things as yet not come to life, which in their seeds and weak beginnings lie entreasured. Such things become the hatch and brood of time, and by the necessary form of this, King Richard might create a perfect guess that great Northumberland, then false to him, would of that seed grow to a greater falseness, which should not find a ground to root upon, unless on you." In response to this, Henry determines that everything that's happened has happened out of necessity. Northumberland was always going to prove a traitor because that's just who he is. And similarly, he's going to do what he has to do because that's who he is. And it's not a very pleasant thought, and it's not a very pleasant frame of mind that he's in. He's starting to see himself and others as pieces being moved about by some guiding force with little say in the matter. And nobody likes to feel like a pawn on a chessboard. So he's in a dark place, and in a weak place. And finally, almost even pathetically, he voices a desire to lead a crusade to the Holy Land. Even though he has to realize that that's probably not going to happen now. He's sick, he's old, and it doesn't seem like the rebellions at home are ever going to end. So he's just kind of dreaming now about this thought that he had that he could redeem himself by leading this crusade. Moving on to the next scene, we see more of Falstaff's stunts firsthand. He's pressing men into the army in each county that he passes through on the way to meet up with Prince John and Westmoreland. And like he did in the last play, we see that the most able-bodied men are getting out of service by paying him a bribe. And these are scenes where almost everyone has an ironic or quirky name, and Falstaff sees humor in most of their names, and he makes puns about them accordingly. And a lot of this is just Shakespeare having fun. He also likes to give characters names that have some meaningful joke attached, and he's largely putting his own wit into Falstaff's mouth. So he's joking about the names of the recruits, Moldy, Shadow, Feeble, and so on. And none of these men are happy about going to the war, obviously, so they're not in a joking mood. We also meet the local magistrates, Justice Shallow and his cousin Silence. Shallow actually knows Falstaff from when they were both younger, and he's not a very likable character. Not even Falstaff seems to really like him. He's a doddering old stutterer, he stutters and stammers a lot, who does nothing but go on and on about how wild he was when he was younger. All he wants to do is talk about the women that he's chased, the fights that he's gotten into, and all the good times that he used to have. At the same time, he's constantly shocked whenever he learns that someone that he used to know is dead or that some sort of change has taken place that he wasn't aware of. So the impression that we get of Justice Shallow is that he's a man who's living in the past, and Falstaff despises him for it, not realizing that, maybe except for the difference in their weight, he's the exact same way. Or maybe he does realize it, and he doesn't like what he sees. They're both two old men, one reminiscing about being young, and the other still pretending and loudly proclaiming to be young. And as he leaves, Falstaff decides that on his return journey from the war, he's going to get as much money as he can out of Shallow. In a scene that we'll talk about next week, he also decides that he can use Shallow to get a laugh out of Prince Hal. He thinks that Hal will be amused by the old justice's lying and his vanities, not really, again, reflecting on the commonality between Shallow and himself. So for next week, read just Act 4 of Henry IV Part 2. A lot happens in that act, and there's a lot to unpack both there and in Act 5, so we're taking a bit longer with this play than we have with the previous two.